It's almost 1 p.m. in Sydney, 11 a.m. in Hong Kong. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets Asia. I'm Paul Allen. Here are the top stories. An historic shakeup in US politics. Joe Biden quitting the presidential race after weeks of relentless pressure, endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democratic candidate. Asian stocks fall with US futures flat as investors assess the impact of Biden's exit. Chip stocks tumbling, TSMC off more than 12% from this month's peak. And China's bond rally resumes as the PBOC cuts a key policy rate and banks follow suit, stepping up support for the economy. All right, some more news on today's top story about Kamala Harris becoming the presumptive nominee for the Democrats after Joe Biden stepping down. An immediate impact on fundraising, topping $50 million online today, just since President Biden announced that he will not be standing for re-election. This is according to ActBlue, an online platform for Democratic fundraising. So $50 million pouring in since that announcement from Joe Biden. Now, the West Coast of America yet to wake up, but it's pretty clear that that decision to step down from the ticket for November, immediately freeing up a lot of financial support that had been sitting on the sidelines in the past few weeks. All right, let's get a check on how markets are faring now. Avril Hong's in Singapore. Avril.
Yeah, Paul, we're actually seeing some relief for the likes of the Hang Seng, given how Biden is bowing out of the race. But it's deeply negative in equities in the rest of the region as we see these chip stocks getting hammered for another week as this Biden exit, I think, provides this additional layer of uncertainty in U.S. politics. And already we saw how the chip names were the ones that bore the brunt of the selling last week. This is an extension of that. And amid all this, also those continued concerns about the Chinese economy, of course, but the dollar is looking slightly softer even against that backdrop. And given that, it's interesting to see how we're seeing weakness on the yen as well as the Japanese currency. Now, the other thing we wanted to highlight out of this part of the world today is how China's central bank unexpectedly cut those the key short-term rate. Let's flip the board and take a look at how that's playing out in China bonds, because this is a trim for the 7-day reverse repo that was not expected. And this is the first time we're seeing this in about a year, and the signal is that supportive for growth. Maybe the PBOC is easing potentially more going forward. And then we also have it seeming to suggest that the benchmark will now be that 7-day repo rate. And we saw the Chinese banks also following suit with that trim to the 1-year and the 5-year loan prime rate. What we're watching is the yield on the 10-year, because we're seeing it now already below that so-called red line for the PBOC, below the 2.25% level. Paul.
All right, thanks very much, Avril. Let's get some more details on the latest U.S. election shakeup. Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn joining us live from Washington. And Vonnie, we're just reporting an immediate surge in donations for the Democratic campaign, $50 million since President Biden made his announcement. What's going on here? Why the sudden rush of money?
It's a huge amount of money, Paul, and bear in mind this is from small dollar donors, right? So the real sort of grassroots of the Democratic Party and those who support the idea of a new unified ticket. Of course, we don't know who the VP pick is yet, but everybody seems to be getting behind Kamala Harris. Just for context, in the 2 days after the debate, President Biden raised $27 million. So this is almost twice that, and it's just been 9 hours since President Biden decided and told the world that he was pulling out of the presidential race. That, by the way, was a surprise even to his own staff. A person familiar with the matter said that he held a call around 1:45, and we know that that tweet got posted on X shortly before 2 p.m. local time, Washington, D.C. This after several days of President Biden being in solitary confinement, if you like, due to COVID-19. We're not expecting to hear from Kamala Harris tonight. We are, however, expecting to hear from her tomorrow morning, local time, 11:30 a.m. So look for comments there. But a huge amount of money, and it does seem to suggest that people are getting a lot more enthused now that there is less confusion about what's going to happen in the the immediate future. This following several weeks, of course, of President Biden saying that he was staying in the race no matter what.
Yeah, you mentioned the removal of confusion, the need for unity as well. We've had endorsements coming in for Kamala Harris, but she's not the nominee yet. Convention just a few weeks away now for the Democrats. Is her nomination a lock, or is something else going to happen on the floor of that convention center in Chicago?
Look, absolutely anything can happen, Paul. Anything can happen between now and Election Day, never mind between now and the convention, which begins August 19th. That said, it did look increasingly likely throughout this afternoon that the whole party and even most donors were getting behind Kamala Harris, and also state delegations who had already cast their votes, if you like, for President Biden. They came out in the later hours of the afternoon from New York, from New Hampshire, from South Carolina, and essentially most of them saying that they were wholeheartedly endorsing Kamala Harris now instead of President Biden. We also had those high-profile endorsements earlier on from the Clintons, from Elizabeth Warren, the Congressional Black Caucus, and it just did seem to pick up steam throughout the day. Now, there were some people that refrained from an outright endorsement, people like the former President Barack Obama. You saw his statement there on screen. Nancy Pelosi also praised President Biden, didn't say anything about Kamala Harris, and we know that she would like an open convention. You asked if anything was possible. Of course it is. We may still have an open or a brokered convention, but it is looking increasingly likely that nobody wants to challenge Kamala Harris publicly. That said, Joe Manchin, of course, has potential for doing that. We know from somebody close to him that he is certainly considering it, and he is giving Fox News an interview Monday evening. And then we also, on Monday morning, have several appearances by those who would put their hat in the ring for VP pick on early morning US shows, so we'll hear from them as well.
All right, Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn there in Washington. Well, let's get some more on President Biden's exits from the candidacy with Charles Stewart, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT. So, Charles, we've now got a situation where the money's rolling in, the endorsements rolling in for Kamala Harris. It's obviously easier for Kamala Harris to access those funds, to access the names of delegates as well. So, logistically, optically, she looks like the smart choice, but is it a certainty?
I think it's as close to a certainty as one can have at this point. I think it comes down to the old saying, you can't beat someone with no one. And we haven't seen in these first few hours any credible candidate come forward who's going to challenge her. So as we've seen with Pelosi and some other, and Obama and some other major figures in the Democratic Party, they're holding off in giving a full-throated endorsement, but we don't see anybody else coming forward to challenge her. So I think it's pretty much a done deal, but it will take a while to finally determine everything at the end.
Well, it was way back in 1968 that Lyndon Johnson said that he wasn't going to recontest the presidency. We had a brokered convention for the Democrats, and it was an absolute disaster. How fresh will that lesson from history be in the minds of the Democratic Party? How important is it to avoid a contested convention like that?
Well, one comment is that Americans aren't very interested in history, and so I don't know that history is going to be particularly relevant here. I think Democrats certainly want to avoid a contentious convention. I think Democrats are kind of caught in the middle, however, because it will look bad if it looks like that Harris is just simply going to be anointed the new Democratic nominee. So she's going to have to show some bit of striving and effort to get the nomination. So I see this happening probably in the first ballot at the convention, but nonetheless, Kamala Harris is going to have to win this nomination rather than just sit back and bask in the glory.
Typically, candidates like Kamala Harris might expect to get a bounce in the polls. What are you expecting in that regard? And do you have anybody in mind for a potential VP pick?
Well, in terms of the polls, what we've seen quite consistently in the season is that those of us who pay a lot of attention to politics, are kind of shocked or kind of moved by different events in the campaign, but the polls really haven't changed. And so I imagine there might be a point or two change nationwide, maybe 2 or 3 points in some states. But I don't think there's going to be a big change in the polls. This is going to be kind of trench warfare to the end. In terms of vice president, on vice presidential nomination, I think the smart money is on a governor from one of the swing states, whether it be the governor from Pennsylvania, Shapiro, Whitmer from Michigan. Those are probably the two front runners right now. But we're going to have to see all sorts of vetting that needs to go on before we finally get there. So right now, the question is to really consolidate support behind Harris.
I guess key to that might be support from President Biden himself. He's going to remain president until January. He's already endorsed Kamala Harris. What role do you see him having in the campaign, and how is his legacy going to look?
Well, I mean, he's going to have, I think, they're going to have to kind of play this subtly. Nonetheless, I mean, I think he's going to have an important role to play as someone who's passing off his legacy to the next generation. There's a lot of affection for Joe Biden right now, and so he has a role to play in legitimating Kamala Harris and reassuring Democrats that this is the right way to go. At the end, though, Harris has to show that she is going to be president if the Democrats are going to be successful here. So Biden can't be too dominant. He's going to have to, give it his all. Finally, I mean, I would say also an important thing for Biden to do right now is to be president and to show through performance the difference between what a Democratic president it would be, whether it's Harris or anybody else, and Donald Trump. And so maybe the best thing that Biden might do is kind of go light on the campaign itself, but to double down on being president and to deal with the important national and international issues that face this country at the moment. Mm-hmm.
Charles, before we let you go, I just want to get your thoughts on the likelihood and what a Trump-Harris matchup looks like, because we now have a situation where the oldest candidate to ever stand for president is now Donald Trump. At the same time, Kamala Harris vulnerable on the issue of border security. So how do you see this campaign playing out?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be play out in some ways similar to how it would have played out with Biden, except for the fact that Harris is going to be a much more vigorous candidate. I mean, we know the Republicans were going to press hard on border security, that Harris is vulnerable certainly in the eyes of the Republicans, because border security has been her portfolio. Nonetheless, I mean, I think that this is going to be a tight race either way, and Harris is going to be a much more aggressive candidate to take it to Trump. I think it's going to be a much more entertaining and vigorous race than we would have seen otherwise.
All right, 4 months to go. Charles Stewart of MIT, thanks so much for joining us with your insights. Still ahead this hour, we're going to get more views on Biden's move to exit the election race for Kamala Harris and what it means for markets, business and geopolitics. Andrew Ferris, the CEO of Ecognisis, joins us next. Later, we're going to ask Michael Fullilove from the Lowy Institute how the US allies are going to be watching all of this. Mark Mickelson also joining us from IMA Asia to talk about the business climate. This is Bloomberg. All right, plenty for markets to digest today, not just the political developments in the United States, and we see futures receiving that pretty well. S&P E-minis better by about 1/5 of 1% right now. We've seen yields easing off a little as well, but all the futures for the major US indexes in positive territory. Look at the right-hand side of that board, though. We'll see what's going on in China. We had a surprise rate cut to the MLF, a 10 basis point reduction there. 10 basis point reduction for both the 1- and 5-year loan prime rates in China as well. The bond rally continuing. In terms of equities, we've got Hang Seng better by 0.75%, but the CSI 300 weaker by about the same amount. All right, we're joined now by Andrew Freris, CEO of Ecognosis Advisory, a global financial and economics consultancy. And Andrew, I want to get to the news out of the US in a moment, but I want to start off with China and the rate cut that we saw this morning to the MLF. How significant do you see that being for the market and the broader economy?
Well, in a sense, it was fairly predictable because the Chinese, few weeks back, said that they will carry on using interest rates, but they will begin to use shorter interest rates in order to calibrate a new way in which the announcements are then percolated through the markets. And instead of changing the 1-year main lending rate, they went for a 7-day reverse purchase rate. Now, the fact that it's only 10 basis points, might people say 10 basis points? Oh, come on. That's very little. But remember, China right now has got an inflation rate which is nearly zero. So in other words, if they went for a 25 basis or a 30 basis points, they will be looking at effectively real negative interest rates. And that's the last thing they want to do. So I'm not surprised as to the size. The size is predetermined by the inflation rate, but the actual cut, really not much as a surprise. The Chinese policymakers have always been very reluctant to actively use monetary policy in the same way, let's say, that the Fed does. They have been slow, deliberate, and very careful in cutting interest rates, and they would prefer much more to directing the banks to lend money, and also, of course, through fiscal policy by simply spending more on infrastructure.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the fiscal side of the equation, because we had the plenum wrap up last week with a 4,000-word communique. I'm sure you've read all 4,000 words. One mention of property, a lot of emphasis on high-quality development. But in terms of actual concrete action, do you feel like there was a missed opportunity here?
Not really, actually, because, oh God, I'm a mini expert on reading the official translations of Chinese documents when it comes to very significant policy-making issues. And in fact, they do it in 2 stages. First, you get something that your initial reaction is that is incredibly long on broad and incredibly short on details, which is completely par for the course. In other words, we will be getting a drip series of additional information on where and how this is all going to lead. I completely agree with you. The 4,000 words document tell you, other than quality growth via technology, concentration on the decision-making role of the party and of the chairman, a little bit less on the role of markets, and then very little on specifics, no surprise at all. And actually, I would find it a little bit unfair to criticize this. This is very much Chinese Communist Party style of announcement, followed by the details. And the details are going to be they're going to be slow and one step at a time coming. That gives them maximum amount of flexibility. In other words, they make the big announcement, and that's the strategy. And then the tactics, how they're going to get there, can be changed, calibrated, and moved slowly.
How well positioned do you feel China is at this time to potentially fight a trade war in 2025, should we have a second Trump presidency?
Well, let's start with something that I don't have a contrarian view, because this has nothing to do with you, it's facts. Look, the GDP growth in China is driven by 2 factors. I'm going to do a Robert De Niro kind of thing. 2 factors. One is consumption and investment. Net exports play a very, very small percentage into that. It can be very important exports for regional and specific classes of industries, but taken overall, China is not driven by net exports. So if net exports were to take a dip, it's bad news, of course. It may remove, let's say, 20, 30 basis points out of GDP growth, but it's not the one who's going to drive the growth. So I think the Chinese very quietly are much more relaxed than we think they are, precisely because they know that sectors of the economy could be badly hurt by a war, but the whole economy will not. Actually, historically, over a 20 to 25-year period, net exports, I emphasize that, not exports, people are obsessed with exports, net exports, exports minus inputs, added on average about 10 basis points for every 100 basis points GDP growth. Not a lot. It varied from year to year, but historically has been relatively low.
Well, that scenario may not yet arise anyway, and let's just assume that it is a Trump-Harris matchup in November, although based on our experience so far, anything could happen. 4 months to go, though, plenty of unknowns. Have you altered your risk allocation at all?
Basically, on the politics side, yes. It's going to make it winning for Trump a little bit more difficult, because now I think he's going to be cornered by policy issues, by debates on facts, on numbers, on directions, as opposed on who was actually the more healthy or very specific personal issues that it has been so far. In other words, a fight between, let's put it incredibly bluntly and politically incorrect, two old men. Now you're going to have a much younger person on which Trump cannot concentrate fire, cannot concentrate personal attacks. And if Kamala Harris is elected, is pushed forward as the official candidate, she will be very well advised, in fact, to concentrate on facts and therefore corner Trump in an area which is not particularly good when it comes to debates.
Andrew, 30 seconds. I just want to ask you our question of the day. Would the US dollar gain or decline if Trump wins? 30 seconds.
Will decline, okay, precisely because of all the issues. First, his insistence on lower interest rates and what he's going to do or not going to do on Powell, and the fact that he's going to really go on the external trade. Yeah.
All right, Andrew Freris, CEO of Ecognosis Advisory, thanks so much for joining us. We have plenty more ahead. This is Bloomberg. Let's get a quick check on the corporate stories we're following today. Samsung Electronics' largest union says it will stage a rally on Monday at the company's chip production complex south of Seoul. The National Samsung Electronics Union expects about 1,500 employees to take part. The planned event comes days after the company and the union discussed a schedule for wage negotiations. Bloomberg has learned that Nippon Steel has hired former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to help complete a proposed purchase of US steel. Sources say Pompeo will act as an advisor to the Japanese firm for its $14 billion bid. The deal faces national security review and opposition from Donald Trump, senior Democrats, and the Steelworkers Union. All right, on the subject of Donald Trump, let's check in on the so-called Trump trade. We've got Korean EV battery shares suffering today, biggest losers on Monday. This is after President Joe Biden dropped out of the US presidential race. We've got analyst recommendations against dip buying in that sector as well. So some questions for the green energy industry ahead of this November presidential election. China Vanke, China Merchants Bank, Sunac China also down today. And we did have a couple of cuts from both the MLF, 10 basis points there, and a 10 basis point reduction to the loan prime rate 1 and 5 year in China today. Not doing much to support stocks, though. Coming up, Michael Fullilove, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute, going to be joining us next on what a Trump or Harris presidency means for US allies in Asia. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. China markets just heading to lunch. This is how things are looking. Seeing a little bit of weakness for the CSI 300, off by 0.75% at the moment. Of course, we did have that 10 basis point cut to the MLF, also to the loan prime rate as well, both 1 and 5 year. Perhaps not completely unexpected, but not doing a lot to support markets there. The consensus seems to be that the real heavy lifting is going to have to be on the fiscal policy side. Didn't see a lot of evidence of that, though, from last week's plenum. All right, let's check in how markets are faring. Avril Hong's in Singapore. Avril.
Yeah, Paul, we're really focusing on those chip names that are getting badly beaten up again this week. I mean, that was really the drag on the Asia stock gauge last week, as this Biden exit also throws another layer of uncertainty in U.S. policies. I think there's very little appetite for such stocks. And don't forget also this week how we have some of the Mag 7s that are reporting earnings is going to be a key test of the durability of this AI rally. And then add to that as well, we have the likes of Morgan Stanley lowering the outlook for Asia IT, including TSMC and SK Hynix, as they pivot to some of the consumer staples in the region. That's what we're seeing in equities, but flip the board, because as we keep an eye on U.S. politics, it's also been really difficult to kind of assess the net impact on the dollar. If we flip the board and take a look at what we're seeing on the face of it, some say that it could be dollar positive if we see a Trump presidency, just because he's talked about tariffs, talked about tax cuts, fiscal stimulus. All these things are inflationary, but we also have maybe that short-term impact, dollar positive, because of risk aversion. But on the other hand, you also hear how Trump has talked about the dollar devaluation. As our colleague Mark Cranfield of the MLive team has been pointing out, though, ultimately what might be more important to watch is the trajectory of the Fed, for what this means for the dollar and what this is going to mean for the short end of the curve in particular. Paul.
All right, thanks very much, Avril. We've been getting international reaction to Biden's decision to exit the race for the White House. World leaders paid tribute to Joe Biden after the US president announced that he's not going to be standing for re-election in November. The prospect of Donald Trump's return to the White House has traditional US allies across the world bracing for a more abrasive and transactional foreign policy style. And many expect the focus to shift away from Ukraine and for tariffs to be used as an economic weapon on China and Europe. Vice President Kamala Harris, who Biden has endorsed for the Democratic ticket, is less well known in Europe and Asia. Our next guest is Executive Director of the Lowy Institute, an independent, non-partisan international policy think tank. Michael Fullalove joins us here in Sydney right now. In his capacity as the head of the Lowy Institute, you've also hosted a lot of world leaders on your podcast, including Joe Biden. So I'd ask you for your impressions of the man and his legacy and just the significance of what we've seen today.
I think it's worth pausing and reflecting on the fact that Biden has been a very fine president. He restored decency and integrity to American institutions after the Trump era. As a foreign policy president, he's been highly effective. He supported Ukraine. He strengthened NATO. In Asia, he's created a situation of strength. He has strengthened US alliances. He's managed the relationship with China. He stood up AUKUS. And now he's taken a very difficult decision, one that very few politicians have the wisdom to do. So I think he's been a strong president, and I think history will take note of these achievements.
Well, you've just returned from the Aspen Security Forum over the weekend, where you've met a number of important figures in foreign policy, including Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan as well. What have they had to say about the potential of a return of Trump to the White House, if anything? And of course, those meetings predated what happened this morning.
They didn't talk too much about Trump. They talked about their confidence in the US alliance system. They talked about the policies that they were conducting. I mean, beneath among the various delegates, both on the from Republican sides and Democratic sides, when we sort of talked off the record, I think there was a lot of concern about Trump's return, about the appointment of J.D. Vance, very impressive young politician, but someone who does not take traditional foreign policy stances. His foreign policy, like Mr. Trump's, are very different from the policies we normally associate with the GOP, that is strong alliances, strong approach to defence. So I think there's quite a lot of there was quite a lot of uncertainty and concern about what President Trump's return might presage.
So let's take a look at some of these alliances that have been built in the region over the past few years, specifically the Quad, also AUKUS. What's their future under a potential Trump presidency or a potential Harris presidency?
Well, I think to start with Harris, we assume that Harris will inherit some of the policies, most of the policies of President Biden, and actually Asia diplomacy has probably been the greatest strength of the Biden administration. She said, I was present at a lunch for Prime Minister Albanese at the State Department in October, in which Vice President Harris said she was a big supporter of AUKUS. You would expect, you would expect continuity, I think, from a Harris administration. Trump is much harder to judge. J.D. Vance and Trump have both said that they support AUKUS. But Trump is a very transactional figure. We know that everything depends on his own interests and how leaders play him. So I would have to say there's going to be more uncertainty. I think if you were to sort of go up a level, you would say that Harris's policies are probably more likely to be consistent with the general US policy framework over the last over the long term than President Trump's. You'd have to say that, I think.
In terms of being a transactional figure, if we take a look at some of these small Pacific Island nations that China has been aggressively courting over the past few years, they don't have much to offer Trump in terms of a transaction, do they? So where does that leave security in the Pacific?
I think that the relationship with Australia would be important there. So what is it? How effective is Australia in persuading President Trump of the importance of the Pacific? You're right that Biden has reached out in a very unusual way towards the Pacific. I think he's hosted Pacific Island states twice. Blinken, I'm sure, has been to Papua New Guinea. There's been a very pronounced level of outreach. Hard to imagine that happening under a Trump-Vance administration. However, as you point out, and others have pointed out, Vance has made repeatedly the argument that in a world of scarce resources, the United States needs to focus more on the Indo-Pacific than it does on Europe. So I suppose that's a sort of level of, if you wanted to be optimistic, you would point to those. But I think the vibe on the Democratic side would be more interested in Pacific Island states than on from a Trump-Harris administration.
And where are we in terms
Trump-Vance administration, I should say. A
Important
lot of names shooting around at the moment.
It's been a very weird couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And where are we left on the question of Taiwan as well? Because we heard from President Trump during his speech to the convention that he would, and previously as well, that he would like to see Taiwan pay more for their protection. At the same time, Taiwan is home to TSMC, so important to the United States. So what's the path ahead here? Where do you place the risk of a war? Well,
look, it's early days to be making predictions about these two administrations and what they might do next year. But as I mentioned at the beginning, Trump is a skeptic of alliances. He is, he wants to put America first. Both he and JD want to put America first. They're likely to be much more transactional, even though JD Vance has said that the United States should focus more on Asia. As you mentioned, just last week in that interview with Bloomberg, Trump basically said that the United States should not defend Taiwan. He didn't say it quite that clearly, but that was a strong implication. He also said that America is no different from a large insurance company, and you've got to pay your premiums. Now, of course, for allies like Australia, for partners like Taiwan, we hope that the United States is more than a large insurance company. I certainly see alliances not about insurance premiums, but about trust and solidarity. So I think that if you were sitting in Taipei, you would probably feel more confident that a Harris-led administration would have your back than Trump would. And I think if Trump is elected, allies and partners of the United States will need to be very adroit, very astute, it will not be for us to be sneering or to be critiquing Trump. It will be how do we manage Trump? How do we manage Trump and Vance? How do we instruct them, or educate them, if you like, on the value of alliances? How do we work with them? Because the United States remains, it sits in the cockpit of the West. It is the most important country in the world. It's at the core of the liberal international order. And so all of us are going to have to lean in.
It's such unusual language to be using when describing an ally. How do we manage them? How does Australia prepare for a possible Trump presidency?
Well, look, it will be complicated because from Australia's perspective, remember the last time Trump was in the White House, Australia was led by coalition prime ministers. Now we've got a Labor government. Albanese and Biden have had a good personal relationship. They've had a lot of things in common. On the other hand, it's hard to think of two more different individuals than Donald Trump and Anthony Albanese. So I think the answer is that if Mr. Trump is elected president, there's probably a 60% chance of that happening, then Australia will have to be a very busy ally. We'll have to find points of commonality at the personal level, at the institutional level. But we can't focus completely on the individuals. We'll have to work with other institutions in the United States. We'll also have to thicken our connections. We'll have to work in conjunction with other US allies around the world to try to stiffen the international order while we're in this period in this feverish period.
All right, Michael Fullilove, Executive Director at the Lowy Institute. Thank you so much for joining us with your insights today.
Thank you.
Still to come, we're going to have more analysis on the US elections, what the outcome could mean for Asian businesses. IMA's Asia's Mark Mickelson is going to join us to share views up next. All right, let's get back to the Indian markets just ahead of the open. We're 2 minutes away from the open of trade. I did mention there we're going to be watching Reliance Industries June quarter trailing the average analyst estimate, falling about 5% from a year ago. Reliance struggling with low margins, calling its operating environment challenging, especially for its energy business. So we've got the pre-market. Most of the markets marginally weaker. The Sensex off about 0.25% right now. Reliance down 1.5% in the pre-market there. Well, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg says he found Donald Trump's reaction to the attempt on the former president's life inspiring, but he stopped short of endorsing the Republican contender in his re-election bid. Zuckerberg spoke exclusively with Bloomberg Originals host Emily Chang before President Biden dropped out of the race.
Well, I mean, look, it's obviously a very important and it'll be a historic election. I feel like I'm best positioned maybe to talk about what our role will be in it and what we're going to do. And look, I mean, the main thing that I hear from people is that they actually want to see less political content on our services because they come to our services to connect with people. So, that's what we're going to do. Where we give people control over this, but we're generally trying to recommend less political content. So I think you're going to see our services play less of a role in this election than they have in the past. And personally, I'm also planning on not playing a significant role in the election. I've done some stuff personally in the past. I'm not planning on doing that this time. And that includes, not endorsing either of the candidates. Now, look, I mean, there's obviously a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world. I mean, the historic events over over the weekend. And I mean, on a personal note, it's, seeing Donald Trump get up after getting shot in the face and pump his fist in the air with the American flag is one of the most badass things I've ever seen in my life. But, and I think, look, at some level as an American, it's like hard to not get kind of emotional about that spirit. In that fight, and I think that's why a lot of people like the guy. But look, I mean, we're living in a pretty crazy time, and I view our role here is to make it so that everyone can express their views on this stuff, but we're going to try to manage it so that way the politics doesn't drown out the human connection and the community, which is, I think, the main thing that people come to our services for. And we're not always going to get that right, but that's what we're going to try to do. And I think that that's probably the best role that we can play.
And you can see that exclusive interview with Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg on The Circuit with Emily Chang. That debuts Tuesday evening, New York time on Bloomberg Television, and also streaming on Bloomberg Originals. Our next guest is chairman of the Asia CEO Forum at IMA Asia, which helps multinational companies in the Asia-Pacific monitor and assess political, economic and commercial developments. Mark Michelson joins us now from Hong Kong. And Mark, in terms of developments, the past couple of weeks have been a pretty wild ride. So it appears as if it's going to be a Trump-Harris matchup in November. We don't know for certain yet, but that certainly appears where we're going. How does that change the picture in terms of both domestic and geopolitics?
Well, thank you. This is always a worry for our members who run Asian operations for multinational companies. We do critical issues at the end of each year, and this is one of the critical issues. What's going to happen with the next administration, whether it's Trump or continuation of the Biden? So one of the things, obviously, China is a key factor, and Hong Kong as well. What's the policy going to be? At the moment, there's not much light between the current Biden administration or potential Harris administration and a Trump-Vance administration. Both are taking a tough line on China. The Biden administration's kept most of the tariffs in place. They've imposed new restrictions, but they have opened a line of communication, which is important among the senior ministers, with the military and so on. And that's very important going forward because although it's not going to solve all the problems, it's going to make mistakes a little less likely.
So let's talk about China then and the potential. Let's just start with the potential for another trade war. How likely do you consider that under a second Trump administration? What might the fallout be from it?
Under either administration, I'd say. I think we have it already to some extent because China is a major competitor. And although there's often talk of decoupling, de-risking, that's really hard to do in practice, given the extensive trade and investment between American and other international companies with China. Of course, many have done China plus one, China for China, things like that, but it's hard to move away from that. So you have to take that into consideration. But at the same time, I think the hostility toward China from either administration to some extent will continue on the trade front because it's felt by many Americans, rightly or wrongly, that they're not doing as well as they should be, and part of the reason is because of globalization and China in particular.
Do you think there's a risk of further than a trade war, like an ongoing decoupling between the United States and China?
As I said, that's harder in practice. It's happening to some extent. Some companies, some international companies that had a big presence in China and Hong Kong and some of the rest of the region have pulled back, and some, if not pulled out, at least reduced their presence significantly. Several of them have not appointed heads of Asia in the past 2 or 3 years anywhere, not just moving them somewhere, but anywhere. And these were companies that were very much involved. This has to do with data security, has to do with content, has to do with a lot of worries, and of course the trade restrictions. So companies have to move around and find other places to manufacture that will not face the same barriers going into the United States or other markets.
Trump and J.D. Vance have also been particularly hot in their rhetoric around the green economy, electric vehicles, the energy transition. How do you see that playing out for investment opportunities in that space in Asia?
Yeah, clearly that's an existential issue, and it's one that China leadership, I think, recognizes, which will put them perhaps more in the crosshairs in a Trump-Vance administration. So that is a big issue. And of course, EVs, highly controversial. It's mentioned in almost every stump speech by former President Trump and I expect by J.D. Vance going forward. So how you're going to handle that is going to be very difficult. I think a key to that, a key target is going to be Mexico, where there's increasing Chinese investment. Chinese suppliers have moved to support American and other international companies that are there. And it's, of course, the U.S.'s biggest import source now. So I see a real issue potentially boiling there under either administration, but probably stronger, I guess, under a Trump-Vance administration.
And how about the fate of Taiwan as well? This is something we were discussing with our last guest, because on the one hand,
big issue.
President Trump would like to, would prefer to see Taiwan making more of a contribution towards its own defence, but on the other, we have a company like TSMC, which is so critical to the United States. So how do you see Taiwan's future playing out over the next 4 years?
I've heard of TSMC. And, you know, it's not only critical, it's critical geopolitically to Taiwan, to the United States, but doesn't, at least on the face of it, doesn't seem to be recognized. So if there's uncertainty about U.S. support for Taiwan, that would cause a potential problem and potential instability, and then leave more room for miscalculation. I think that would be the worry. The Biden administration, President Biden in particular, has made some statements that sounded pretty strongly supportive of Taiwan. Whether that's completely accurate or not, it's hard to tell. But in the other case, we have statements by former President Trump that suggest that there might be some flexibility there, which would make a lot of people more nervous, I would say.
All right, will you help multinational companies in the Asia Pacific from your client's point of view? What's the better outcome in November?
Well, I don't know if there's a better outcome. And, you know, most of our members, at least on the face of it, don't express their views one way or the other. They did pretty well under a Trump administration, as you can hear from an economic standpoint. And then we had COVID and all the rest of the complications under Biden, but have found ways to transverse that. So I'm not sure if they see a big difference. I suppose that, you know, without favoring one side or the other, a little more uncertainty, I think, in a Trump-Vance administration at this point on a lot of those issues, including ones that affect them very strongly, including trade agreements, which there haven't been many lately, even under the Biden administration. So there would be some caution.
Mark, we're out of time, unfortunately, but Mark Michelson of IMA Asia, thank you so much for joining us. Plenty more to come. This is Bloomberg. All right, let's see how we're tracking on Indian markets at the moment. A little bit softer today. We've got the Sensex off by about 1/3 of 1%. Banking stocks off by about 1/2 of 1%. We do, of course, get the budget out of India tomorrow, so we'll unpack that for you in tomorrow's show. The rupee is still pretty weak, 83.65 against the US. Reliance Industries, one we're watching, off about 2% right now after June quarter earnings trailed the average analyst estimate. So pretty weak performance in 3 of its 4 key businesses. Let's take a look at chip stocks as well, because of course the big news today, we've likely got a new matchup in November in the US, probably between Kamala Harris and former President Trump. TSMC off by 2.75% there, but all of those tech names a little bit weaker today. Bitcoin, one of the few assets to rise. Gold performing reasonably well also. All right, that is it from Bloomberg Markets Asia. Horizons Middle East and Africa up next. This is Bloomberg.